Just in, Canada breaks US control. 18B aluminum bombshell backfires on America badly. In less than 1 year, Canada quietly redirected nearly $18 billion USD in aluminum exports away from the United States. There was no public announcement, no emergency trade summit, no diplomatic rupture between allies. A trade relationship that had defined North American industry for over 100 years was broken without a single headline, and Washington never saw it coming. For more than a century, the United States treated Canadian aluminum as a guaranteed input. It powered American automobiles, aircraft, power grids, and defense systems. Washington assumed proximity meant permanence. That assumption is now proving dangerously wrong. Canada did not retaliate. It quietly shifted power away from the United States, rerouting its aluminum toward Europe, and Europe is embracing it wholeheartedly. What looks like a narrow aluminum story is actually the first visible crack in a much larger structure. The hidden cost nobody talked about. Before tariffs were even fully escalated, the damage had already begun. Internal industry estimates showed that trade war volatility had already added between 12% and 18% to aluminum procurement costs for US manufacturers. This increase did not come from global shortages. It came from risk. As tariffs targeting Canadian aluminum climbed and contract terms became unstable, US buyers were forced to price in uncertainty. Insurance costs rose. Hedging costs surged. Long-term supply agreements collapsed into short-term purchases. According to open-source manufacturing assessments, this instability alone pushed aluminum-related input costs higher across the automotive, aerospace, and power infrastructure sectors by more than $25 billion within a single year. Canada absorbed none of that shock. Instead, Canadian producers redirected supply toward Europe, where carbon-based trade rules offered something the United States could not: predictability. Where Canada went instead, and why Europe said yes? Canada's hydropower-driven smelters produce aluminum with significantly lower carbon emissions than most global competitors. Under Europe's carbon framework, low-emission aluminum avoided penalties that reached several $100s per ton for higher-emission producers. Canada's hydropower-driven smelters suddenly became premium assets rather than discounted suppliers. Europe did not hesitate. Germany, France, and industrial buyers across the European Union accelerated long-term contracts, locking in Canadian aluminum volumes years in advance. By mid-2025, analysts estimated that nearly one-quarter of all new Canadian aluminum contracts were tied to European demand. Every low-carbon shipment reduced both emissions exposure and supply chain risk. Canada did not negotiate power, it inherited it. The real damage to the American economy. By the second half of 2025, the aluminum disruption had moved far beyond trade statistics and into the daily economy of the United States. Open-source industry assessments showed that cumulative excess costs tied to aluminum supply instability had already surpassed $45 billion across manufacturing, infrastructure, and public procurement. These losses were not driven by global shortages. They were driven by volatility, uncertainty, and the sudden loss of predictable access to Canadian supply. Analysts tracking cost pass-through effects estimated that aluminum-related instability alone added between 0.3 and 0.6 percentage points to consumer inflation during the year. For households, this translated into higher vehicle prices, rising home renovation costs, delayed grid upgrades, and higher utility bills. Employment pressure followed quickly. Manufacturing associations warned that prolonged uncertainty was freezing capital investment decisions across aluminum-exposed sectors. Automotive producers delayed plant expansions. Aerospace suppliers postponed hiring. Internal labor impact models estimated that continued volatility could place between 150,000 and 250,000 industrial jobs at risk over the next two investment cycles. Not through sudden layoffs, but through cancelled growth and delayed replacement hiring. Public finances absorbed the shock as well. Federal and state infrastructure programs began reporting cost overruns tied directly to metals, procurement delays, and repricing. Grid modernization projects slipped behind schedule as aluminum conductors and components became more expensive and harder to source reliably. Analysts estimated that aluminum-driven cost overruns alone were adding tens of billions of dollars to publicly funded projects without delivering any additional capacity or resilience. National security supply chains were not immune. Aluminum alloys are critical for aircraft frames, naval structures, armored vehicles, and missile systems. Defense contractors quietly revised production timelines as delivery schedules became less predictable and input costs rose. Industry estimates suggested that aluminum-related disruption reduced effective defense procurement capacity by several percentage points within a single year, forcing trade-offs between quantity, cost, and readiness. Canada did not absorb these losses. Europe did not share them. Why the US couldn't fight back? The structural trap. The deeper problem was structural. US primary aluminum production had declined steadily for more than a decade. Since the mid-2010s, domestic smelting capacity fell by roughly 15%, leaving the country increasingly dependent on imported aluminum, precisely as trade volatility intensified. Rebuilding that capacity is not a short-term option. Industry assessments estimate that restoring lost smelting output would require more than 10 years, tens of billions of dollars in capital, and access to low-cost clean electricity that most regions do not currently possess. Tariffs failed to restore domestic production and instead accelerated supply chain diversification away from American influence. Internal trade modeling circulated among manufacturing groups warned that tariff-driven uncertainty had already reduced the US share of influence over North American aluminum flows by billions of dollars annually. Once contracts shifted to Europe, they could not be threatened, renegotiated, or reversed by executive action. How Europe won without firing a single tariff. Europe's strategy was not confrontation. It was regulatory certainty. The European Union published carbon pricing trajectories years in advance, locked enforcement timelines through the next decade, and tied market access directly to emissions performance rather than political alignment. For manufacturers, this eliminated the single greatest risk factor in global trade, unpredictability. So, by late 2025, industry estimates suggested that European manufacturers had secured long-term low-carbon aluminum contracts covering volumes equivalent to nearly one-third of Canada's export capacity. Germany alone emerged as a cornerstone buyer, absorbing rapidly increasing shipments as it decarbonized its automotive, aerospace, and industrial base without sacrificing output. Europe gained three things simultaneously: reduced exposure to high emission suppliers facing carbon penalties, stabilized industrial input costs during a period of global volatility, and strategic supply chains pulled closer to its regulatory orbit. Every compliant shipment strengthened Europe's position as the rule-setter rather than the rule-taker. The reputational collapse, trust as a trade asset. Surveys of global procurement executives conducted by industry associations revealed a sharp downgrade in perceptions of US trade reliability. Policy volatility, unilateral tariff risk, and short contract horizons replaced proximity as the defining features of American market access. Canada, by contrast, climbed in rankings of supplier trust precisely because it aligned with Europe's rule-based system. This was not a loss inflicted by confrontation. It was a loss inflicted by miscalculation. Washington assumed loyalty would endure trade war pressure. Europe priced carbon and removed politics from the transaction. Canada followed the incentives that rewarded stability over submission. The bigger wave coming: steel, cement, fertilizers, energy. Aluminum is only the first exposure point. The same trade war logic is now colliding with carbon rules across steel, cement, fertilizers, and energy-intensive manufacturing. By the end of the decade, analysts estimated that more than 40% of US heavy industrial exports would struggle to remain competitive in markets applying carbon border mechanisms. Canada, by contrast, entered this period with structural advantages. Hydroelectric power dominance, cleaner industrial baselines, and early alignment with European carbon accounting positioned Canadian exports as compliant by default. Industry forecasts suggested that by the early 2030s, more than 60% of Canadian industrial exports could qualify for low carbon trade preferences, compared with less than 20% for the United States if no major policy shift occurred. The long-term economic reckoning. The financial implications are severe. Conservative projections indicated that prolonged loss of preferential access to allied supply chains could shave between 1 and 1.5 percentage points of annual U.S. economic growth over the next decade, representing trillions of dollars in foregone output when compounded over time. Capital responded accordingly. Institutional investors, pension funds, and sovereign entities increasingly reallocated funds toward jurisdictions aligned with future trade regimes. Canada benefited disproportionately, with clean industrial assets attracting tens of billions of dollars in inflows as investors sought regulatory stability and long-term returns. The United States, facing policy volatility and unclear industrial direction, saw comparable investment decisions delayed or diverted abroad. As supply chains rerouted around the United States, Washington's ability to influence outcomes diminished. Tariffs lost effectiveness when suppliers no longer depended on American market access. Pressure tactics backfired when alternatives existed. Canada did not need to resist. It simply diversified until resistance became unnecessary. The window is closing. Supply chains once rewired do not snap back. Contracts signed today shape investment decisions for years. Infrastructure built to serve Europe will not easily pivot back to North America. The window for course correction is closing faster than policymakers acknowledge. The United States now faces a narrowing choice. It can adapt industrial policy to the new rule set, invest heavily in emissions reduction, and restore predictability to trade relationships. Or it can continue down a path where volatility substitutes for strategy and pay an escalating price with each passing year. If aluminum was only the beginning, what happens when the next wave of carbon-based trade rules hits steel, energy, and agriculture at full scale? Predictability is now the rarest and most valuable asset in global trade, and the United States is running out of it. The question is no longer whether this shift is real. The question is whether Washington is willing to respond before the next wave of supply chains moves permanently beyond its reach.